to study together with you, at least to touch on some elements of this story, is the story of Samson, a well-known story, which is the subject, one of the subjects in the book of Judges. The book of Judges has three parts. The first part is the continuation of the previous book of Joshua, and then the part of the book is the story of various judges. That doesn't mean they're sitting in a court. I don't think Samson sat in a court that was judging, but it means a leader of sorts. And the book of Shoftim has four main judges. There is Devorah, Gidon, Yiftach, and the fourth is Shimshon. Story of Samson. Samson is the last judge, and his story is told over the course of 4 chapters in the book of Judges, beginning in chapter 13. The story is an unusual one. I don't think there's a similar story in the Bible of this man with supernatural strength, and the story raises a host of questions. But I wanted to begin by focusing on one question. I think that, those who read Sherlock Holmes remember that in the with the Scarlet, studying Scarlet. So he solves the case very simply, and Watson says to him, "How do you figure it out?" Holmes says, "The problem in this case was not we didn't have evidence. We had too much evidence. And the trick is figuring out the one piece of evidence that's significant." So in the story of Shimshon, the trick to figuring out many things is to solve the core issue in the story of Samson. And I think the core question in the story of Samson is this. Samson is not just a warrior, he is a Nazirite, he's a Nazir. And the core issue, the core question to be solved, once we solve that, many other things will fall in place. Either this afternoon, those who want to continue on their own to read the story of Shimshon. It's a great story. But I think this primary question is, all the other judges are not Nazirites, they're not Nazirim, just Samson. Why does God want a Nazirite to be the leader of the people? So, what I like to do is to look at the text and not to make pronouncements about what I think the text is saying, but rather to try to see how, from the text itself, and I do believe there is a text, and some people think there's no text, there's all kinds of stuff, but for those who haven't been in the academy, there is a text for our purposes, and to try to demonstrate at least how one can read this text and what emerges from the text. So if we have the story of Shimshon, which begins in chapter 13, and the story of Shimshon, the beginning of the Shimshon story begins before he's born. It's the birth of Samson. We have in the Torah other stories that are connected to the birth of someone. The story of Isaac, for example, the birth of Isaac. The angels will come to Abraham's house and inform Sarah, and Abraham is previously informed that Sarah and Abraham will have a child. So the story of Shimshon, and of course in the book of Genesis, there are 3 of the 4 matriarchs have difficulty having children, and they make all kinds of efforts to have children. They ask their husband to pray for them, or they ask the husband to give them, or they offer their maid servant as a wife, etc., etc. Book of Genesis that we are reading now in the synagogue is replete with such stories. So the story of Shimshon is a story along those lines, but it's very different. But the first thing we notice, for those who study the story of Samson is embedded in the book of Judges, and therefore you can't read it actually in isolation. One must read it in conjunction with the other stories. Now, for those who have studied the book of Judges, certainly are aware of the following. The book of Judges has a pattern which repeats from beginning to end, and the pattern is this: 6, 7 times. The pattern is this: the book of Judges describes Israel as straying from God, worshipping other gods, sinning in some sense. Then it describes God's punishment of the people. God hands them over to some enemy. Then the people cry out to God, and then God is sending some kind of savior. And this theme, without going through all the sources right now. Anybody who picks up the little book of Judges and reads it, that pattern becomes apparent. Now, the significance of patterns in general is this. Patterns do two things for us. First of all, they connect stories, just as type scenes connect stories. And they invite comparison. But equally, if not more important, is that the patterns invite distinctions. So therefore, when we start the story of Shimshon, which is chapter 13 of Judges, chapter 13 begins in the following way. I'll read it in the Hebrew. ויוסיפו בני ישראל לעשות הרע בעיני אדוני, וינעם אדוני ביד פלישתים 40 שנה. So the Israelites continued to do evil in God's eyes, and God handed them over to the Philistines for 40 years. That fits the first two pieces of the pattern, sin and punishment. Now what we expect next is that the people will cry out, as they've done throughout this book. And to our amazement, the next verse says, "Vayish ish echad mitzarah mimishpachat Adoni u'shlom manach v'ishto akara v'lo yalada." The text immediately tells us of the birth of Shimshon, and Shimshon the birth is announced, as it were, by some messenger of God. That's the subject of this chapter. We'll look into it a little bit. But what's interesting is what is missing. This is actually a very important point in the text. What is missing? There's an important distinction in text between what is not there and what is missing. Many things are not there. How do you know that it's missing? Missing means you expect it to be there. And you expect it to be there because the book has set up that anticipation for us. And that's the function of the pattern. It breaks the pattern. Let's start with that. The first thing we notice. Now, what is the significance of breaking the pattern? What that suggests to us is that God's sending of Samson as a deliverer of Israel is not in response to Israel's perceived need for deliverance. It's quite possible that the Israelites are perfectly comfortable with the Philistines, with being handed over to the Philistines. In fact, a reading of the Samson story suggests this very strongly. Later in the story, after Samson has wreaked havoc amongst the Philistines, so the tribe of Judah, which in the book of Judges is the leading tribe, the book begins with, "Who shall lead us?" The tribe of Judah says to Samson, "What are you making trouble for? Don't you know, Alo Yadata, Ki Moshelim Banu Plishtim, that the Philistines are the Moshelim, they're the rulers? What are you starting up for?" To which Samson says to them, "Whatever they did to me, I did to them." "Oh, we have to hand you over," they say to Shimshon. And Shimshon says, "That's fine. Just don't kill me. You don't kill me." So they tie him up. They tie Shimshon up. And of course, they leave, and Shimshon breaks out of the bonds, and he smites the Philistines. That's a very instructive statement. Don't you know that the Philistines are the kings, are the Moshelim, are the rulers? They seem perfectly content with that situation. The only one not content with that situation is God. God's not happy with this, because whether the people realize it or not, these are God's people. The Philistines are moving in on God's territory. God doesn't want that. And therefore, God is determined to fight the Philistines. There's a problem in the text. In the story of Moses in Egypt, so Moses runs away from Egypt, runs off to Midian, and meets the daughter of the priest of Midian, and have a child. And Moshe says, he names his son Gershom, for he says, "I was a stranger, I was a ger in a foreign land." It presumably refers to Egypt. In other words, he's aware of the fact that Egypt is not his place. He's the only Jew who would appear in the story who's aware of the fact that that's not my place. And that awareness is probably a function to some extent of leaving. So then God, who is determined and has promised to deliver Israel, has to convince the one candidate to go back to Egypt. Moses is a very reluctant candidate for many reasons. At the end of the day, he agrees to go. God in the book of Judges has a bigger problem. There were no candidates. There's nobody. The Israelites, it would appear, are perfectly happy with being subordinate to the Philistines. So therefore, God is determined to deliver Israel from the Philistines, but God will not find an Israelite. There is no Israelite. And therefore God creates a person, I would say God's child. That's the point of this chapter. And that's the point of the Nazirite. The word Nazirite actually is a very interesting word and an interesting concept. There's a whole chapter in the Torah about the Nazirite. And that's the 6th chapter of the book of Bamidbar, book of Numbers, chapter 6. There, the Torah allows a person to be a Nazirite. What does it take to be a Nazirite? Strikes us. Any man or woman, it starts in chapter 6 of Numbers. You don't have to trust me, for those who have the Bibles, you can look it up. Don't trust anybody. But when it comes to Torah, you shouldn't trust anybody to see it. So, a man or woman, Isha or Isha, ki yafli lindar neder nazir. What does it mean, ki yafli lindar neder nazir? Who wishes to pronounce the vow of the Nazirite. Here we come to a very important point about the Nazirite. The Nazirite becomes a Nazirite through the medium of a vow. A vow means something you take upon yourself. There are different kinds of vows. There are oaths, shvuot, there are nidarim, and there's also the neder of nizirut. Interesting kind of vow. There's also the vow of giving sacrifices. You dedicate an animal. It's also a vow. It's also a neder. So the Nazirite is a kind of vow. What that means is that somebody determines at some point in his life, to become a Nazir. And when you look at chapter 6 of the book of Numbers, something is very interesting about that chapter. And that is the chapter spends about half the time in the chapter describing not how one begins the Nazirite life, and not about the restrictions of the Nazirite that's mentioned, but a good half the chapter is spent on how one terminates the Nazirite vow. The Nazirite vow in the book of Numbers is a temporary state. There's something about being a Nazirite in the Chumash which is very problematic. Already in our rabbinic tradition, various opinions about is it a good thing, is it a bad thing. The truth is, it has positive elements, it has negative elements. The Torah calls the Nazirite holy. Nachmanides, the famous Nachmanides, thinks the Nazirite is the prototypical holy person. The Torah says, Kedoshim Tiyu. You should be a holy people. It's called the holiness code. So the Ramban says right there on the spot, it doesn't mean fulfill, it means fulfill the Torah, but go beyond that. Go be a holy people. What does it mean to be holy? Where do we find this concept of holiness? It says Nachmanides, that's the Nazirite. The Torah called the Nazirite holy. On the other hand, many others, in the Talmud and beyond, felt the Nazirite is very problematic. Rashi thinks of the Nazirite in some sense as a sinner, as rejecting this world, even things that are permissible. And Rashi cites the view of the Talmud that the reason the Nazirite brings the sin offering at the end, when he terminates his vow, is because being a Nazirite is sinful. The Ramban said quite the opposite. He brings the sin offering, says the Ramban, because he's terminating. Why are you stopping? Exactly the opposite. In any event, the Nazirite in the Torah is two things. A, it's something you take upon yourself, and B, it is temporary. Torah did not specify the amount of time, but it's temporary. And the Torah allows it. Torah allows this man or woman to be a Nazirite, which sounds in the Torah like a high priest. The Torah allows somebody from the tribe of Zebulun, let's say, wakes up one morning, I want to be the high priest. The Torah does not forbid it. The Torah allows it. The Nazir means two things in the Torah. It means to be separate. Lehi Nazir means to separate oneself. But it's also a play on a different word, the word Nezer, which means a crown. The high priest, Nezer Shemin Mishchat Kodesh. His head, says the Torah, is holy. Upon his head has been poured the anointing oil. So in the Torah, the Nazir is holy, but problematic, temporary, and it's a function of one's acceptance upon oneself. Now we turn to the story of Samson, and we realize the Samson story is a strange one for two reasons. First of all, the Naziriteness of Samson, the fact that he's a Nazir, is not a function of his vow, because he's a Nazirite before he's born. God's angel, God's messenger goes to his mother and instructs his mother not to eat things you shouldn't eat, not to drink wine, for the child shall be a Nazirite from the womb. Zir Yahanar min habeten. He'll be a Nazirite from the womb. He's born a Nazirite. That's different, so we didn't accept it. It's given to him. And furthermore, it's clear in the story that not only is he a Nazirite from birth, but he's a Nazirite until the day of his death. That means he lives as a Nazirite. If we understand the Nazirite, one can understand the Nazirite in many different ways. It's interesting to study various texts and to see how they understood the idea of being a Nazir. I would say that, without getting to the study of it, was about limitations of time, that the rabbinic tradition, at least in the Mishnah, I think the Talmud for the most part follows this, that if you ask, and the halachics certainly see it this way, if you would ask them, what is a Nazirite, they'd say something like, well, the Jews have 613 commandments. The Nazirite is 616. The regular Jew just doesn't drink a little wine. That's one way to read it. One could read the Torah, Parsha in the Torah that way. When you come to not the rules of the Nazirite, but the type of person the Nazirite is, we are hard pressed to say that Samson is a regular Jew who doesn't drink wine, doesn't cut his hair. Far from it. Samson, actually, when you read the story, is in no way Jewish, in no manner, shape, or form. His entire career is amongst the Philistines. He cavorts with the Philistine women. He abandons the Jews. In fact, his only connection to the Jews in the Samson story is the one I mentioned before, where the tribe of Judah ties him up and hands him over to the Philistines. Truth of the matter is, the Philistines also tie him up. Delilah, Samson and Delilah, in the last chapter, she ties him up. Before she figures out what the source of his strength is, she ties him up. So the Jewish wife. What? Initially, he has a Jewish wife. She's not Jewish. The woman of Timnah. No, she's not Jewish. No, on the contrary, his mother said to him, why not find a nice Jewish girl? The mother say that, and the parents, he goes to Timnah. This is the one I want. I'll get to that in a second. He says, what are you going to go to the Philistines for? Can't find someone who's Jewish? No. And what does he say? What does he say? Let's find. That's an important verse. Take this one for me, he says. Let's find this verse. Take this one for me. Why? Let's find that verse. That's a very important verse for us. Take this one. It's chapter 14. This translation, 500. We'll start at 549. That's fine when he speaks to his parents. Was it 549? Yes, 549. Verse number 3 on the bottom of the page. Chapter 14, verse 3. Aren't there the daughters of Israel? Bnot Achecha, and people of our own nation? You have to go to the Philistines? And Samson said to his father, take her from me. She is suitable in my eyes. Later, in verse number 7 on the next page, Shimshon goes down to speak to this woman. Batishar b'yeinei Shimshon, she was suitable in Samson's eyes. And what does it mean, she is suitable? What does it mean, she is suitable? There's a difference in biblical Hebrew between the phrase Yashar b'yeinei, Yashra b'yeinai on one hand, and the word to like or to love. The first wife of Samson, the woman of Timnah, is Yashra b'yeinav. I would translate, she suits my purposes. The last wife the last woman, Delilah. He loved the woman in the Sorek Wadi. Her name was Delilah. There's a difference between very nice in a certain way. She suits my purposes. He's going to use her. That's what happens in the story. He will use her to fight against the Philistines. All of Samson's battles against the Philistines are never on behalf of Israel. They're always, and I mean always, personal. Always. So, by the way, this distinction between loving and Yashar B'Yenai was not invented, well, maybe it was invented, but we find it not only in the story of Samson, but we find it in another place as well, which is chapter 18 of the first book of Samuel. In that story, Saul is David is beloved by the people, so Saul is determined to get rid of this David. Jealous of David, he dislikes David, fears David, suspects David. So he says to David, why don't you marry one of my daughters? He has two daughters. The oldest is named Merav. And the book of Samuel says in chapter 18, and Saul thought, he says, marry my daughter Merav on condition you fight the wars of God. Milchamot Hashem, the wars of God. And Saul thought, why should I kill him myself? Let the enemy kill him. So he'll fight, so he keeps on fighting the wars of God. At some point, he'll die in battle. I'll rid myself by giving him my daughter as a wife. But David says to Saul, look, he says, I'm not worthy. I'm not worthy. Who am I? He says, I'm not worthy. Keeps delaying him, so she's given to somebody else. Then Saul hears that his second daughter, Michal, loves David. Verse 20. Vatehav Michal bat Shulat David. Page 613. It's a good page, 613. Vatehav Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David. Vatehav. And they told Saul, Vayishar hadavar b'yeinav, and it was suitable in his eyes. So then Saul sends his messengers, why don't you marry David? Marry my other daughter. I have another one. So David says, first, who am I to do it? I'm a poor man. I can't even afford the dowry. So Saul sends his messengers back to David on page 614. The king doesn't want money. He wanted to kill 100 Philistines. And Saul thought, I'll kill David through the Philistines. And the servants of David told David this, verse 26. Vayishar hadavar b'yeinei David. Here we have the same word. And the matter was suitable in David's eyes. What is the book of Shmuel playing with over here? You have three characters. If anybody hasn't studied the book of Samuel, I strongly advise you to do so. It's one of the greatest things ever written, period. It's an unbelievable book. There's three characters. There's Saul, there's David, and this woman, Michal. Michal unequivocally loves David. It's unusual that the Bible says the woman loves the man. Usually it's the man loving the woman. Vatehav Michal et David. The father wants to use her to get his enemy killed. Wants to make his own daughter a very young widow. That's King Saul. David initially refuses, but then finally, Vatishar b'yeinei David. Why does he refuse initially, and eventually he agrees? He refused the first one, but the second one he agreed. It's suitable. The second one is suitable in his eyes. What's the difference? The difference is this. The first one, Saul said, fight the battles of God. We all know there are never-ending battles of God. So David says to himself, at some point in time, I'm going to be killed in battle. So he refuses. I'm unworthy. Second one, the same thing. I'm unworthy. No, I want 100 Philistines. That I can do. In fact, in the text we have, not in the Septuagint, the text we have, he kills 200. Why does he kill 200? I'm sure that's the correct text, by the way, because 100 makes perfect sense. 200 makes no sense, so therefore 200 is right. Actually, 200 also makes sense. 200 is because actually he doesn't want to be Saul's son-in-law. He wants to be the only son-in-law, the main son-in-law. He's laid claim actually to both of the daughters, 100 for the second and 100 for the. In fact, Saul had said, "B'shtayim titchatein b'ayom." Literally, you'll marry 2 today. So David determines that's a workable number. She suits his purposes. What's his purpose? To use her as a stepping stone to becoming the king. It's a brutal book, by the way. Apologists aside. And there you have the contrast. And that's the story of Samson. But, whereas the book of Shmuel is critiquing Saul and David, here's the important point. The book of Shoftim is not critiquing Samson. Samson is actually not, he's not critiqued. I defy anybody to prove to me in the story of Shimshon that there is a critique. He is doing God's work. He's on a mission. His mission is to fulfill God's purpose in defeating God's enemy. And as long as he remains loyal to God, the text itself, at least as far as I can tell, does not condemn him. Where he gets into trouble is when he meets Delilah. It's a great. Vayehav Isha Benach. He loved a woman in the Sorek Wadi whose name was Delilah. He can't afford to love this woman, because in loving the woman, he's going to get in deep trouble. He's going to do something which will cause him to lose his strength. The strength is a function in the Samson story of the fact that he's a Nazirite. The Nazirite, the image of the Nazirite in the Samsons, the primary image for Shimshon, is he doesn't cut his hair. And the Philistines go to Delilah, and they say to Delilah, find out where his strength is coming from. So he expresses one story, another story, another story. Finally he says, it's because I'm a Nazirite from birth. If you cut my hair, I will lose my strength. And she puts him to sleep, and she cuts his hair. When he wakes up, he thinks he's going to be strong to fight off the Philistines, but the strength has departed from him. I would say that, of course, it's not the cutting of the hair that causes him to lose his strength. The cutting of the hair is emblematic of something else. What caused him to lose his strength is the fact that he's broken this intimate connection to God. He can't reveal the secret. There's something, he has secret knowledge that nobody else has. And the secret knowledge is a function of his very special relationship to God. Born a Nazirite, not born a Jew, born a Nazirite. In order to clarify this, I would point to another character in the Bible. I said there's nobody like Samson, that's true, but there is one person who actually has some very striking characteristics that are similar to Samson. He's not technically a Nazirite, but he is called by the Torah a Nazirite, and in 2 different places. Both at the conclusion of the book of Genesis and the conclusion of Deuteronomy, of the last book of the Torah. He is called a Nazir, both by his father Jacob, who blessed him, and both by Moses, who blesses the tribes. And that person, of course, is Joseph. The blessing, said Moses, should accrue to the head of Joseph. Rosh Yosef, Ukad Kod Nazir Echav, and to the head of the one who is Nazir Echav, separated from his brothers. That's what Moshe refers to Joseph as a Nazir. And Jacob, in blessing Joseph, also mentions Joseph, describes Joseph in the 49th chapter of Genesis. When Jacob blesses all his sons, when it comes to Joseph, he refers to Joseph as Nazir Echav, as the one who was separated from his brethren. And what's interesting, if we think about this, of course, our first impulse is well, it's a literary phrase. It shouldn't make too much of it. Usually when we say that, not always, but usually, bad mistake. Because almost always there's more to it. When you begin to think about Joseph and Samson, there are very striking similarities between Joseph and Samson. For example, One of the things, Joseph is somebody who has special knowledge. He's able to interpret dreams. In fact, Joseph not only is the interpreter of dreams, he also has dreams. 17-year-old boy has, and big dreams, I would add. The brothers all bow down to him in the field. The sun, the moon, and the stars bow down to him. And we have words nowadays for such people. But the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bow down to me. He doesn't think small, at the center of the universe. He's a dreamer. He's also the great interpreter of dreams. Now with Samson, we don't have dreams. But there's something else in the Samson story that we do have, which is very striking, not so different. For those who have not read the Samson story, I would advise you all to do so. First, it's a very interesting story. And very instructive in many ways. But Samson is not dreams. Something else. Riddles. Riddles. Samson has riddles. And in more than one place. The first riddle, famous riddle, is when Samson is going to the Philistines, he encounters a lion. And he kills the lion. He comes back later. Inside the lion is a beehive. So when he gets to the wedding party, he says, I have a riddle for you Philistines. His wife has invited 30 friends to the party. So Samson, I have a riddle. My riddle is, from the powerful one, sweetness came out. That's the riddle, essentially. And they can't figure it out, until finally they pressure his wife, threaten his wife, and she tells them the riddle. At which point Samson goes and kills 30 Philistines to pay his debt to them. But the idea of a riddle, I would say that a riddle is not a neutral answer. To riddle somebody. Even in English you have it, to riddle somebody. He was riddled. He was shot with many bullets. His body was riddled. Riddle has a negative, hostile connotation to it. But Samson not only is a riddler, he also interprets riddles, one might say. When he slays 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of an ass, after he does that, he has a little riddle. Bilchia chamor, chamor chamoratayim. 4 words. Bilchia chamor, the jawbone of a chamor, chamor chamoratayim. What does that mean? So he interprets it for us. Bilchia chamor, kiketi elefish. Chamorim in biblical Hebrew can mean piles. Chamorim, chamorim. We have it with the plagues. Bilchia chamor, with the jawbone of a chamor, chamor chamoratayim. He's a riddler. He also interprets for us. He gives us the interpretation of the riddle. So in each of these two characters, there is the secret knowledge that no one else has. He stands apart from the others. Joseph is, when Joseph lives with his brothers, they throw him into the pit. And when he gets to the land of Egypt, they throw him in jail, which Joseph calls a pit. He's in a bar and eat with his brothers. He's in a bar with the Egyptians. He's not an Egyptian. The Egyptians see him as a Jew. The Jews see him as an Egyptian. He's neither here nor there. He's a Nazarite. There's actually a deeper connection between Joseph and Samson. Interesting one, and most important one. Joseph essentially is God's emissary. When you read this is an important point about the Bible in general. There are 2 ways to read the Bible. You can read the Bible as the narratives of the Bible, as a story of human history, human beings' triumphs, usually their failures, mistakes. And mistakes lead in the Bible, mistakes have consequences. It's behavior and its consequences. The consequences of harming brother, is exile. Not so much as a sin, but as a consequence. That's one way to read the Torah. Why do the brothers go down to Egypt? Because they sell Joseph, because they try to kill Joseph, or they cause the sale, etc., etc. One could read the whole book of Genesis that way, that it's all a product of human error, the consequence of human error. That's the correct way to read the Torah. There's another way to read it. Another way to read the going down into Egypt, it's not a function of human error, mistake, or sin, but of God's plan. God said to Abraham, I have a covenant I offer you a covenant. Abraham says, what does it cost me? What must happen for this covenant to be fulfilled? And God said to Abraham in chapter 15 of Genesis, know very well that your descendants will be strangers, will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. Only afterwards shall the fourth generation return to the land. Those who wish to enter into that covenant, those who choose the covenant, will be covenantal. When Joseph is sent to his brothers, probably to make peace, after he antagonized his brothers with his dreams, and Jacob sends Joseph to find his brothers. And what happens in the Torah? When Joseph seeks to find his brothers, he gets lost. And what happens? In chapter 37 of Genesis, when he's lost, ish, a man found him, and Joseph was lost. And the man says to him, what do you seek? I seek my brothers. And the man said, they've departed from here. I heard them say they went to Dothan. So Joseph seeks his brothers in Dothan. Before he gets there, they saw him from a distance and conspired to kill him. Says Rashi, who was the Ish? Who was this man? The angel Gabriel. You read that, you smile, angel Gabriel. My friends, I know about Gabriel, of course, but Rashi says it's actually the simple reading of the Torah. Doesn't mean angel. It's God's messenger. God is sending Joseph into exile. The same Ish that appeared earlier in the Torah when Jacob wrestles with the Ish, tries to block Jacob from entering the land. Jacob overcomes the Ish. In the great story, he becomes Israel. He crosses into the land. And the Ish, in the Joseph narrative, sends Joseph out of the land. And what is the point? Why did the Torah have it tell us about the Ish? Because otherwise you read the Torah incorrectly. You read it only as a function of human history, but it's not that, says the Torah. You must read it both ways. You must read it as a working out of God's plan, but not only that, it's also a function of human history. I remember reading once Robert Alter suggesting that it's only a working out of God's plan. If he suggested that, he's incorrect, but it's both. It's both. Who brings us down to Egypt? Who enslaves the Jewish people? Who is the main character in the story? It's Joseph. And for most of Joseph's life, he doesn't understand that. For most of his life, he thinks he was there to sustain his brothers, to sustain the family, to feed the family, to save the Egyptians, to save the world. That's all true. But that's not the primary purpose of Joseph. At the very end of his life, the last verses of Genesis, he understands, I was the first slave. We need redemption. And that is the parallel to Samson. Samson is God's instrument. And as long as that's his mission is to defeat God's enemies. As long as he stays on task, he's perfectly fine. God can't find a Jew. So God creates somebody. It's interesting, by the way, that the text of Justice suggested in the following way. When the angel comes to the house, there's something else interesting about chapter 13, by the way. When you read it in context of other narratives, the Bible must be read, the narratives are all connected. Exactly how that works, that's a very good question. Is it a later author working off an earlier text, knowingly working off another text? Are there a set of texts which are enmeshed in some way, speak to each other? What is commonly known today as intertextuality. That's actually a misnomer, but something along those lines. It's hard to know. When you read the story of Samson's birth, it's a birth story. You can't read the birth story of Samson without thinking of the birth story of Sarah, and the birth story of Rachel, and the birth story of Rebecca, and above all, the birth story later, a few chapters later, of Hannah. And all of those stories, unlike the story of Samson, somebody in that family, usually the mother, is concerned she doesn't have a child. The women want to have a child. either they pray for a child, or they ask their husband, or they offer their maidservant, or they find mandrakes or whatever, and they try some way to have a child. In this case, in the story of Samson, remarkably, they don't ask for a child at all. Neither does the woman nor the man, who's totally absent in the story. Someone comes to this woman and says, you're going to have a child, this is what you have to do. And she goes back and she reports much of this to her husband. And your child, says this messenger of God, in Judges chapter 13, will someday redeem Israel from their enemies. So the woman goes back to her husband, right? He will be the redeemer of Israel. On page 547, where we began, just a short while ago. The woman came and told her husband, a man of God has come to me. He looked like an angel, very frightening. 548. I didn't ask him who he was. He didn't tell me his name. He said, you'll have a child. He'll be a Nazarite from birth. She doesn't mention redeeming Israel. She mentions some of the details. Then Manoah prayed, said, please God, this person, send him back to tell us what we should do, how we should train this child. So God hearkened to Manoah. And the angel of God came to the woman, and she was sitting in the field, and her husband was not with her. What is that about? Manoah says, please tell me what to do. Of course, when the angel finally speaks to Manoah, all the angel says is, whatever I told your wife, you got to do. But it's very striking. Please send me this, tell me what to do. Vayavo hamalach el ha'isha basadeh u'manoach isha ein isha. The angel went to the woman in the field, and the husband was not there. Now, in the Bible, women don't go into the field to meet strange men when the husband is not there, because they might get in big trouble. In fact, when the Torah speaks of rape in the field, it says, in that case, contrasted with in the city. So, field means where there was nobody to help her. Nobody to help her. Furthermore, the expression vayavo XLY in the Bible often has a sexual meaning. So what the Torah is suggesting over here is very simply, it suggests the basic idea, which of course is central to the story. This is God's creation. And because this is God's creation, as I said before, his mission is to carry out God's will. Which is why in the Samson story, you have something else very striking, very unexpected in the story of Samson. Book of Judges, essentially the core idea of the book of Judges is about a period in Jewish history where we have a failed leadership. All the heroes are deeply flawed, except for Deborah. Deborah is not flawed. She's a different flaw. She's a woman, which means she's great. But we're the men. And that's the point of the story, actually. The men are failures. So she's forced to do something, go to the battlefield or whatever, that she shouldn't have to do. I'm not subscribing to that point of view, but that is the best way to read that story. So the point is that when it comes to Shimshon has his task. And the father of Shimshon is completely irrelevant. But typically in the Bible, the men represent the society, patriarchal, for the most part, patriarchal books. God has determined to defeat God's enemies. And Samson, on one end, is this brute, enormous force, enormous power. But in the story of Samson, you have something you don't have with other judges. He actually prays to God. And he prays to God twice. He prays to God after killing 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of an ass. He cries out to God, God, you have brought this great redemption, and I will die of thirst. And God allows Samson to discover the source of water, to bring him back to life. And Samson prays at the end of his life, when he's eyeless in Gaza, when he's in jail, when the Philistines are mocking him. And he turns to God one last time. God, allow me to avenge myself for the loss of my eyes, to avenge myself from my enemies. There's something very powerful, very tragic about Samson. But about the intimacy is very striking, actually. It's not what you expect. And of course, he's regaining his strength. The regaining of the strength in the case of Samson, that's the beauty of the story, is not just because his hair is growing back. It's because he has somehow regained that connection to God. The connection is regained for Samson through an act of prayer. The intimacy is a function of his prayers. So in conclusion, I'd like to say the following. One might ask the question, when you first read the Samson story, it's so much not us. These kind of stories appear in other traditions about the supernatural, powerful hero. But actually, it's a story that has great relevance to all of us, I think. Because what it's actually about, in a very extreme way, is about having a particular mission. And the difficulty of staying on course is a very difficult mission. He answers to God alone. Samson answers to nobody else. He doesn't live amongst the Jews. The Jews and Samson have a common enemy. To that extent, he's the redeemer of Israel. But it's about being on task. It's about figuring out what is your mission and about carrying out the mission. I invite all of us to go back to the story of Shimshon and to read it very carefully. One of the interesting questions is, to what extent is Samson aware of his mission? That's a good question. My take on it, at least 10 minutes to 5 on this Sunday, may change next week. But in reading it, and you read it so many times, I think at the end of the day, he's aware. I think he's on task. And he prays to God for one thing. I was put on earth to do something. Give me the resources, give me the strength to do it. At the end of the day, that's also everybody's prayer.